the arrival of younger format Encik Khairi Jamaluddin, Minister of Youth and Sports, and distinguished guests. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for our national anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seat. Yang berhormat Encik Khairi Jamaluddin, Minister of Youth and Sports. Yang berbahagia Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, Patron of Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking. Yang berbahagia Professor Datuk Dr. Hassan Said, Vice Chancellor and President of Taylor's University. Ms. Angela Fok, Vice President of Student Experience, Taylor's University. Ms. Maizura Mohsen, CEO of Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking. Associate Professor Dr. Chandran Somasundram, Chief Adjudicator of Nationals 2014, and fellow guests. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening. Welcome to the grand finals and closing ceremony of the inaugural Malaysian Nationals Debating Championship 2014. My name is Atika, and I'll be your MC for today. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here tonight to witness four of the best teams in Malaysia battle for the coveted title of national champion. Before we begin, I would like to thank several individuals and organizations for making this event possible. My list is quite long, so bear with me. So, our greatest appreciation goes to Yang Berhormat Encik Khairi Jamaluddin and Ministry of Youth and Sports for making this grand event possible. Everyone in this hall highly appreciates their dedication to expanding the Malaysian gaming circuit and to increasingly elevate the quality of our local sports. I would also like to thank Yang Berbahagia Dr. Saifuddin Abdullah for your continuous support, without which we would not be able to reach new heights within this community. I would also like to extend our gratitude to younger Bahagia Professor Dr. Hassan Said, Miss Angela, and Cape University, agreed to become our co-organizers in their remarkable of Nationals 2014. In addition, I would also like to thank MIDP, who's brought the idea of Nationals to life, and for working hard these past few days to bring you this event. Last but not least, a big thanks to the Adjudication Corps, consisting of Dr. Muhammad Abdul Latif and Mr. Shafiq Bazari. They're coming up with the challenging motions for this tournament. A big round of applause to all these individuals and organizations for making Nationals 2014 possible. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I would like to invite Mr. Hazim Talha to the stage to recite the dua.
لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا. ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا. ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. O God, with our words, our actions, and our deeds, we counted in our mizan, in our good deeds, and allow them to be a means by which you enter us into paradise by your grace and by your mercy. اللهم على خير خلق محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you very much, Hazim. And now, for the moment we've all been waiting for, it is time for the grand finals of Nationals 2014. And now, I would like to pass the floor to the Speaker of the House, Ms. Natasha Gideon, to commence the grand finals.
Thank you, Ms. Atika. My name is Natasha Gideon, and it is with great pleasure that I chair the Malaysian Nationals 2014. Let's give a big round of applause for the finalists. In opening government, we have KDU University College B. In opening opposition, University Malaya B. In closing government, University Technology Mara G. And in closing opposition, Asia Pacific University. Judging the grand finals, we have young performer Insyed Khairi Jamaluddin. We have Dr. Muhammad Latif from IIUM. Mr. Hafiz Murat, formerly from Monash. We have Mr. MLUM, and we have Mr. Alex Lowe, formerly from MLUM as well. On the motion, this House would make the right to have a child conditional upon would-be parents' financial capabilities. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to set the debate.
In a world where children do not have their basic needs met and suffer extensively in the short and long term because of the lack of these necessities. We think the state has the right and needs to intervene extensively in order to ensure that these children have their basic needs met. We think that the right to sustain another life is contingent upon the ability of that life. What's our 3-point mechanism for you today? We think the state can determine a specific level of income which allows you to sustain a family. Secondly, we think basically in order to have a second child, you will have to have a higher level of income than is necessary for the first child. But thirdly, right, for people who violate this mechanism and have a child anyways, what will we do? We'll take the child away and we'll put them in state-sponsored foster care. We will also impose a hefty fine upon these people because what we intend to achieve with this policy at the end of the day is to ensure that the right people who are financially capable of providing for these children are the only people who provide and have children to begin with in the first place. First argument. We tell you that second level. Why is it important that we take the children's income the financial capability to provide for these children into consideration? Why is it so important? No, thank you. Because we think, Mr. Speaker, that we think that children themselves need to be protected extensively in this case. Because we think that given that children are more likely, are entirely contingent, reliant upon the family to have these benefits, we think that parents play an extra role in society, extra role, particularly in developing these children, and the children must have this in order to qualify as good parents, because they need to adequately provide for the basic necessities of the children. Okay, second argument of benefits, but before that, I'll take it.
There are no parents who are not educated enough to know what's in the best interest of their child, but have a lot of money. Would you then as well ban them from having children? No, Mr. Speaker. Under our policy, we will only ban parents who are not able to financially provide for these children in the first place. But Mr. Speaker, we will not do what we say in this plan. We will not do that because we think that in this case, it is imperative to acknowledge that our financial capabilities, let's say, a very real reality, and very important in ensuring that children grow up well. But also, Mr. Speaker, second argument of benefits. Firstly, we tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the outcome of this mechanism is that less people have children that they cannot support financially. In most cases where this happens, we think that children are forced into scenarios which are unfortunate,
such as child labor, for example, because we think that ultimately children have no choice but forced these unfortunate because their parents are able to financially provide for them. That is why in ghetto, in poorer areas of society, where incomes are generally low, we see higher crime rates. That is the example of how this tangibly spills over into poorer areas of society and is hence affected by that, Mr. Speaker. But also, we think, why is it justified? Why is it justified to remove the right of parents to have children? Because we acknowledge that currently as well, parents have the right to have children. The right of a child is present. Why is it okay for us to take away that right? So, we think that it's okay for us to take away that right because the right is also the only way that you will guarantee that those freedoms are only being able to guarantee because upon the removal of other freedoms, because in order to ensure that the right of the child to life is sustained and maintained, we think that the right to have a child from the parents must first be limited in order to ensure that the rights of child are extended to the fullest. Because the harms of the provision of the right for children, for parents to have children, and how this will potentially harm the child in the long term and in the short term as well, we think that it's justified and in order to limit these rights of people to have family in exchange for the child's right, the full right to life. But also, Mr. Speaker, we tell you thirdly on the birth lottery, right? We think that it is unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, because no one here gets to choose which family they are born into. Some people get born into financial poor families, some get born into rich. So what does the state do in this case to mitigate the harms of the birth lottery? What the state does, this is what the state does. The state ensures that children do not get, even if people are born into people who want to have children, the state regulates that and prevents that from happening so that children are not put through the harms of the birth lottery, i.e. be forced into other forms of things that they don't want to find themselves in, other forms of misfortune, essentially. This is for all these reasons, we're very, very proud to defend and protect the rights of children and the rights of them to obtain the basic necessities in life. We hope.
It changes because the device attached to it.
These are all people who have done nothing wrong, but they are simply discriminated the fact that they are born into poor families. It means that this form of oppression has to stop, and we believe that this form of oppression
just here.
Because what we have heard by opening down is very economic, right? It simply suggests that people in poor families may not go up to the protective by simply not receiving better education. We believe that these are all very subjective, right? Because the kid may be perceived as poor, but at the end of the day, it's the relationship itself, the kid growing up healthily, the kid growing up happily with the parents is essentially what is there to ensure that he or she is successful. Not whether or not he or she has better hope or not whether or not he or she has better watches and items. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you two examples. Number one, on how we should change the right to procreate, and number two, on how financial capability is never the right yardstick to stop this form of procreation. Right? So let's move on to the rebuttal first. Let's see what their problem is. Right? Firstly, they came up here and talk to you that their problem is lack of necessity. We don't believe that necessity is essentially the problem that we are facing now. Because let's take Malaysia, for example, right? Because we already have tons of social welfare to actually help those who need things the most, right? Things such as GST, which has recently accepted financial aid, such as your food, such as your education, and such as your healthcare. From this means the state is already recognizing the right of poor people, right? But secondly, in the form of social welfare, like VR1M, where the government is actively giving this form of handouts to people, suggests that these poor people are already recognized by the government. We don't see why they are now implicitly inconsistent by slapping down the rights of these poor people who they have recognized in the very first place, right? And secondly, we talk about how now this form of children need to be growing up successfully. We question that notion, right? Because you cannot come here and tell me what exactly constitutes a child growing up successfully, right? Because all these ideas are very simple. If a kid believes that he or she is growing up happily, if the kid believes that the family is providing him or her enough, then we believe that that is sufficient. Because you cannot tell me that your wealth at the end of the day will ensure you to be a better person. We have also people from very rich families who grow up to be people who cannot function in society, right? We have people who from very poor families eventually rise up through the ranks and end up in very good citizens of the tree itself and end up out there. We simply don't see the logical link that one of the people is born poor, they are doomed to a life of failure, right? Something that's like our have to go to us. But thirdly, they give this very idea of child labor. If your problem is with child labor, have better regulations, right? Not stopping them from giving birth at the end of the day. Because you have to understand, if your problem is with too many children, focus on things such as family planning, focus on education, even the poor itself, on whether or not they should maintain this balance or where they can actually sustain their children, right? If you believe that the whole blanket policy of clamping down on their right to go away is actually a very harmful one, because at the end of the day, if your problem is with child labor, you have a lot of couples out there who simply want to have children in their company, who simply want to have the idea that they can go up, that essentially provide help to their children to actually go up to these people who are more successful than they are. We believe that this blanket policy is very harmful because these people never did anything wrong in the first place other than born by the lottery of birth to the poor families itself. I'll now move on to my first right to both ways. My idea, first level is the idea of lottery of birth. This will flash directly to the idea. What exactly is the form of lottery of birth, right? It's when people have no control over which family they are born into. Either they may be born into a rich family or they may be born into a poor family. But you have to understand this. Why are these people now discriminated because of something that they did not do in the first place? These people did not choose to be born into a dysfunctional family that cannot provide them proper education, and to result a cycle or vicious cycle, and they themselves cannot have good education. So we believe at the end of the day, these people themselves may want to have children who do not share the same fate as them. These are the people who want to make sure that their children grow up to be better persons than they are. Because even at the end of the day, just because we believe that these people are poor and cannot provide optimum level, which they will never be making, to these children, that you should stop them, right? Because at the end of the day, recognize this, right? Why should the government essentially punish people for something that is not true? These are not people who come to the problem. These are not people who have already committed crimes such as domestic abuse. These are not people who have already had previous experiences of torturing their child. These are just people who may, in your idea, not have enough money to support the child. You don't believe so, right? But secondly, on the idea of lowest common denominator of society, on how government has always tried to help this vulnerable society. The idea is this. Most often than not, these are the people who are the people essentially that the state failed by the state itself, where the policy of the state has failed to actually cater for them, where they do not enjoy the benefits that are already coming from government itself. These are the people who have done nothing wrong, but essentially are born into the lowest common denominator and the most vulnerable in society itself. At the end of the day, children can have very beneficial effect on them, right? Because at the end of the day, the idea of having children, you make them happy, but it's not essentially for the own purpose, right? It's the idea that I was a victim of this, and I will now try my best to bring forward my child, and make sure that my child will not have the same thing as me. It's the idea that you are giving life to another person, and at the end of the day, we believe that these poor people also deserve the right to actually go to it, because at the end of the day, they can do what the parents could not do for them, and essentially make their child successful, right? But before I go on, yes, okay. Look, your idea of quality of life cannot be solved by this policy, right? Because at the end of the day, you cannot tell me that your policy will simply remove the social gap in society. There will always be poor people and there will always be rich people. But at the end of the day, what makes them happy is what's important, right? You cannot come here and tell me that you have to give them this optimum level of education when we have already shown you that these people, this basic level of education is what is needed by them to succeed in life. So let's move on to my second point on how financial capability is not the right that state to stop the parents, right? Because at the end of the day, we believe that financial capability is unpredictable and very arbitrary in nature, right? Because you may be rich at a certain point, but at the end of the day, when you are poor, then you simply cannot control it. The fact that in status quo, when you already give baby and due to certain circumstances, you are currently suffering from financial crisis, and the state does not take away the baby from you and submit them to welfare, shows that the state is willing to help these parents to actually support their children. At the end of the day, you simply solve your problem also when you say that you will simply take them away and put them into this form of daycare, right? We don't believe so. Because if we are really sure that the state and status quo are willing to help these parents sustain their children, it means that they should be, at the end of the day, basically consistent. The idea is this: state government has come out here and show us two things. Number one, the info will eventually lead to a worse quality of lifestyle, and secondly, on how this baby, because of this bond will directly become non-functional members of society. We don't believe so. We are very proud of it.
Freedom opposition for a speech to defend their case to invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Speaker, the birth lottery is terribly unpredictable. People forced families that just can't support. The states have taken responsibility to mitigate those things, and we do that in this country. Now, I'm going to talk to you about how this policy forces parents to move out of the sphere of poverty, which directly catches with an argument, and such. But before that, I have a couple of questions to ask in response. So, is social welfare currently enough for parents to raise their children? The first response would say that a lot of states don't provide social welfare for kids, and in only very wealthy countries like the United Kingdom, they provide child benefits for each child that would have, for example, 250 pounds. But also at the same time, a lot of countries that do have social welfare still have children who fall into families that are impoverished and who are treated neglectfully. We don't think welfare is enough for you to raise a family. In fact, the states can have families that don't need welfare, that's much better than policy. But second, can this kid have a successful life? We agree that some people can grow up to become successful, some people can just jump out of that poverty trap and become individuals who are successful. But in most of the scenarios, it is impossible to do so. Why is this so? Because when you are given an impoverished life, it's harder to access education, especially when your parents need you to work in their farms. Your parents distract you with things that you need to work in order to gain income for the family, and the parents can't really send you for education. That higher level of distraction leads to these children living an uncomfortable life. More often than not, it's not just about education that prevents you from moving up in life, right? Given that you fall into that come from an impoverished family, the community that you involve yourself with leads you to more crime-related activity, which makes it harder for you to jump out of that poverty trap again. Yes, sometimes these kids can have a successful life, but most of the time, we need to prevent the harm that comes to these children. But next, they ask us, well, we need to ask answers. No, thank you. Could these children have grown to live a successful life? We think we are not preventing anything, right? You can't say A is robbed of a chance of a successful life when A didn't exist in the first place. We think that this is important to recognize, because I don't mean to be mean, but it's better because that harm didn't exist in the first place, and there's no one that can say that harm that the chance to become successful was taken away at the end of the day. For all those reasons, we don't. But let's go on to we don't agree with their responses. But let's go on to our arguments, right? They told us that some people are of circumstance. We don't think that is enough of a justification to tell these people deserve the right to have a child. We don't think if these people are victims of circumstance, they should start working away from that circumstance, not bring someone else into that same circumstance. I think that if that circumstance was to be harmful to that child, we think we need more explanations. They also told us, well, the states can protect all children, therefore that is a great thing. So we don't really need this policy. This isn't true. The states don't have enough funds to protect all children. Take all children from impoverished families and put them into foster care. What we can do is to at least stop them from having to be born into impoverished families in the first place, right? That's why some people are put into foster care and a lot of people are not put into foster care in status quo. I will get closing. No, we won't, because we can't do that in the first place, right? No, you won't. What am I going to talk to you about in my speech? I'm going to tell you how this policy provides a further motive for parents to crawl out of the poverty. Because we recognize and we agree with our opening opposition when they tell us that a child is important to the right, the child is important to a couple, right? Couple, for example. And this child is something that they strive to have. But more often than not, given that they are within the poverty and they are free to have a child whenever they want, they don't necessarily have that motivation. They just blindly follow that suit of having a child and staying within that same bracket of income. We don't think that this is a good habit for parents to pursue and a habit that states should encourage, right? What we think our policy does, it creates an ability for individuals to start accessing the middle class. How is this so? Because when you realize that the only way you can have a child is that you need to have more money, individuals will naturally start to work harder in order to get that money to see. And they realize that the child wants to have a brother or a sibling, then they work even harder to get another level of income than they get. We think this provides a further motive for parents to crawl the poverty line. So we think in these situations, we do have parents who will start having children, and the right to reproduce is still provided at the end of the day, given that they themselves have the incentive to access that level of income in the first place. Why is this good? I think what happens under our policy and why this principle is justified is because once they start to crawl out of the poverty line, I think in these situations, this becomes better for the economy in general, right? So less people will be under welfare states can provide to more people under status. So whether that's better for society altogether. But before I go on my next level of analysis, social mobility is not mutually exclusive to your side, right? You can also solve problems that they afford. Why are these potential harms so dire that we deny these children the right to access? The reason why you can't the reason why you're not motivated to move out of the poverty line want to have a child, because I think what they're trying to imply is that when you have a child, you are encouraged to move out of the poverty sphere, and therefore you will become a better person yourself. The reason why this doesn't happen most of the time is because once parents have that child, they're pretty much content with that child being the way that they are, and that they can use that child to work in their farms, to work in the way that they want the child to be. This is terrible for that child, right? That's why Sebastian told you in these situations, it's more likely for children from ghetto communities or poorer communities to have a high. It's more likely for ghetto and poor communities to have a higher crime rate because children within this sphere are exposed to that community, and if that community cannot support the child in the first place, this child is going to lead to a life of crime. That life of crime is the one that's going to support the family at the end of the day. That family is going to be happy with that life of crime. We don't think that this is fair upon the child, right? We think what we need to do is that given that some people are victims of circumstance, we can't punish every child who is about to be born into society. There is no justification to knowingly allowing people to fall into a terrible life. For those reasons, we should.
I feel very much insulted as a friend inside telling me that just because my family is poor, I will grow up to a life of crime. I will not be able to socially progress, will not be able to make my life better, gain money for my family just because I come for a poor family. Mr. Speaker, we think that the upbringing, the very fact that you have been brought up in an environment that is not enough, like what the government says, an environment that you do not get the luxuries of life, that very much motivates you to actually progress up the social ladder. That very much motivates you to get better education than your parents, Ms. Speaker, because you do not want to subject your very children to that exact life that you've been through, Ms. Speaker, and you want to bring up your parents to a better condition, Ms. Speaker. And the very fact, and another problem we have with the opening government, right, is that they tell you that parents are content with having children. They no longer feel the need to make more money or earn more. Ms. Speaker, that might be possible in certain cases. But what about parents who actually think of their children and who want to socially progress? You are making a policy that denies every single parent the right to make that decision, the right to socially progress. And we do not think that is fair as a whole, Speaker. Then they come up here telling you that social welfare is not enough, right, Speaker. They tell you that children are not being taken care of enough just by social welfare. That's the problem solution mismatch. If you think that social welfare is not enough, get the government to give more money lah. Get the government to help you progress more, Mrs. Speaker. And it will tell you that before that, yeah. Mr. Speaker, if that's the case, then I would say that Malaysia as a whole is not a good household. Malaysia as a whole that isn't well, Mr. Speaker, because that is the fact we are not a rich country, Mr. Speaker. If you were to say that just because you come from a poor household, everyone is doomed, well, you're talking about half the population in Malaysia, because there is a social polarity within Malaysia, and we do have a lot of people who are underprivileged. So I'm going to talk to you on the arguments from the opposition side. I'm going to explain to you on how it exacerbates the social gap within society and how it is the duty of the government to care for its citizens. Mr. Speaker, we have to acknowledge the fact that income disparity has already polarized our society drastically. Why? Because the amount of money you make determines where you live, what kind of residence you live in. It determines what kind of education you get and how far of an education you get. It tells you, you can see right now that the rich kids are living in Bangsa and the poorer ones are living in Tulusang, like what you said, Speaker. This kind of social grouping, right? Because you are okay, so you are within a particular social income, a particular income level, Speaker. You are restricted to the people within your community, and you do not really mix well with other people from other income. You do not really mix with other people from other income levels, Speaker. You see how in the schools you go to, Mr. Speaker, it also depends on the amount of money you have, because I can't afford to live in Taylor's. Poor kids like depend on this government scholarship and go to public schools. Rich kids go to private schools. That's not a mix. But you see right now the government is trying to bridge the social gap, right? That's why they give you scholarships. That's why they give you funding for people who can't afford to go to rich schools. Because they want to have this diversity. They want to have this sort of merging between people from different classes. And we think that the government's proposal is further exacerbating the social gap in society. Because, Speaker, you're telling people that just because you do not have a certain amount of wage, right, you're not eligible to the right that basic all humans have, which is the right to have a child, right? The basic right does not determine your capability. Income does not determine your capability to raise that child. Income does not determine your capability to actually to in any way, Speaker. You're denying, Speaker. We tell you right now, what the government is doing is they're enforcing a materialistic mindset within society in which you have to gain money, you have to be rich. Money is everything, or else you can't have a child, something that normal people should be able to do. We think that this sort of mindset within society is not it's not a good teaching that the government should have. Yes. The government's original problem, right, in which we have couples who can't afford to bring up their children. We think that that should not be solved by preventing parents as a whole from having children. You should teach parents family planning, so that they can determine themselves at what level, at what is their limit to having a child. Mr. Speaker, the social welfare will be more effective. We will be able to reach out to the people who need it more when you have a society that knows their limits and boundaries, in which how many children, how big of a family they can support with. So this is how it goes hand in hand, right? We think that what the government should be prioritizing is in giving a choice towards the parents into determining how much, what is their limit, what is their limit, then Speaker. Why do you say, on my next level, right, which is on how we think that it's the duty of government to care for its citizens. Mrs. Speaker, we think that the government has always been the protector of the poor. The government has always been trying to level out the disparity within our community, right? And we think that the government should be principally consistent in their stance, in which the poor are, those who are with lower income are on equal basis as anyone else, Mrs. Speaker. We think that there should not be a discrimination towards those who simply do not have whatever the government's income the government has. Now, when you take away a child from a family simply because that family is not capable, we think that this further harms that child. That child might love living in that original family in the first place. With that, we back to a close. Thank Deputy Leader of Opposition. That ends the opening half of the debate. To open the closing half of the debate, I'd like to invite
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm proud to stand here today and debate about responsible parenting in front of my very own parents. Because although they regret having me as a son so far, maybe if I win 10,000 ringgit tonight, they'll change their mind. I also like to do a very good evening to YB, Courage of Wounded, who I can see still beaming with happiness that Manchester United managed to salvage a point last night against Chelsea. Ladies and gentlemen, two major criticisms of the opposition. First, although they told us that love and affection is so important when it comes to parenting, they never contended why it was more important or more objectively better for a child to be loved and cared for in a poor family rather than a child being in a family who was financially capable of taking care of them. Because in the second speaker's speech, she agreed that if you have more money, your child is more likely to enjoy more things and have a better life. Secondly, she told you, and they contradicted themselves by saying that Malaysia is not very rich. No offense, but at the same time, she wanted to provide free healthcare, free welfare, free schooling, free toys, free babysitters, and we don't think that in this country, especially, that's a viable option. Before I move on to my extension, where I'll talk to you about how we remove the stigma that poor parents are bad and that poor children are bad children, as well as secondly, how we empower the choices of women, especially in patriarchal countries like Malaysia. Two things I need to clarify. First, we're not trying to guarantee a life of luxury for these children. We're not ensuring that the parents can buy them iPhones or live in mansions or send their children to Oxford. This is basic sustenance, ladies and gentlemen, like clothes, food, health insurance, ability to pay for public school tuition, and having a roof over their heads. It's not about luxuries. But secondly, we don't need to prove that financial capacity is the direct cause of having great kids, but that there is a clear causation and correlation between financial capacity and the ability to raise good children and keep them away from crime. So moving on to that, why are finances the primary quantifier before having children? So although we agree love and affection is very important, we believe that financial capacity should be the ultimate barrier. Why? Because finances are an enabler to good childhood. We agree with that opening. The fact that you have parents who can give you food and give you shelter, give you insurance, and buy you toys and buy you childhood. But on a second further level, in the principle of mutual inheritance, the state cannot make up for things that it cannot do. It can force people to help them do those things. That's why when the state can't provide enough welfare for the poor, it can introduce taxes like GST or raise tax brackets so that the state has more money to give to the poor. Similarly here, if the state can only provide free education and free schooling in the public sphere, in private sphere, it can force parents to ensure good quality of life for their children, and they cannot pretend on that principle, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, why does the state have a responsibility to enforce this law? We will contend for closing government that having a child is not a fundamental right of people, because children are essentially citizens in waiting. They must eventually care for in the future after parents have cared for them for the first 18 or 21 years of their lives. Firstly, because parents are transitional caretakers. When a child reaches the age of majority and can become a voter, become a politician, start businesses and enter contract, that child right there is the construct of all the experiences and the childhood that this child has gone through. That means that the parent is directly responsible for how the child is as a citizen when the state must care for them in the future, ladies and gentlemen. So we don't think that parents have right to arbitrarily create citizens that it can't care for. Citizens that could be involved in crime, that could have bad childhood, that could become unemployed in the future. But secondly, we tell you that having a child only provides abstract benefits or abstract enjoyment for individuals. There is no actual objective benefit to have a child, and we don't think it's okay if you have a child, you force them to work on a farm, and you love that, ladies and gentlemen. But the objective harms that a child faces when a parent cannot care for them, those are real harms that we can measure. The fact that you don't have enough food, the fact that you don't have health insurance, the fact that you don't even have a roof over your head. These things can be measured, but the aesthetic benefit of you enjoying the fact that you have a child, or you can actualize the dream of having a child, those things are unmeasurable, and the state must prioritize things they can measure over things that are aesthetic and abstract in nature. Moving on to my extension, but before that, I'll take over.
Food, shelter, and toys are then expensive at the end of the day. How can the state objectively determine the situation of a child before they are even born?
Yeah, I think our opening quite rightly pointed out that obviously the state can make basic calculations as to how much we need for a child to be born. You should have asked them that, not us. But okay, well, thank you. On to my extension, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, how do we remove the stigma of bad parenting from the poor? Let's understand that we agree with our opening opposition that children who come from poor backgrounds or parents who are poor and have children tend to be people who are shunned away from society. People who, kids, for example, poor kids have less friends from other, or the middle income or the elite income, because no one's paying them. Other parents will let them play at the playground. The children who come from poor backgrounds, when they grow up, more likely to be unemployed or less likely to have a college education. What we do under our model is that we force people to wait, and we think that it's not unbelievable to think that eventually people can save up enough to have a child. Obviously, the poorest of the poor also may never be able to have a child, but the people from the lower income, the low middle income, all they need to do is wait a couple of 5, maybe 7 years before they can accrue enough savings to have that child. So what we do is we remove that stigma that people have. We tell individuals in society that these people are good parents and they are capable parents, ladies and gentlemen. That means that it's less likely that richer children won't want to play with poorer children in playgrounds, so that richer parents won't let their children play with other poorer kids, ladies and gentlemen. Because now these people have children only when they are ready, and not necessarily the stigma that surrounds them that was there before is there. Second extension, how we empower the choices of women. In this country especially, there is an expectation that when you are a woman and you're married, that you must have a child. And although some women want to follow a career path and have a job, they are usually forced by their husband or by their families to have children. What we do under our policy is to empower women's choices. Because now a wife can say, hang on, Sayang, we do not have enough money to have this child. This is getting let us have this child. That means you empower women to tell their husband, why don't you let me go and have a job rather than stay at home and be a wife? Why don't you let me have my choices? And we think under our model, women will be able to offset all that pressure that they feel from the people around them and only have children when they are ready. That means that they have more choices, that means they're more likely to be able to pursue their careers, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, opposition has not been able to contend that finances aren't important, nor have they been able to contend that love and affection is more important. We've also told you on my extension that we remove that stigma from the poor as well as empowering choices of women within society in Asia. We're very, very happy to report. member of government for a speech, to invite the second speaker, member of poverty. Secondly, we are not saying that what's unfair. We make choices until we have people who are poor. You think that's something that you are the state and the first thing that's something that's and third, remember how people also have the right to people that we already have, right? How each society is going to react. Because now we are what we are doing essentially, we are using the microphone, right? We are liberating the citizen, what is the to have a right, to have a family, to have a core value of society. Before that, we will. First, balance of power will be from the right? See, they use the example of elections and they tell you that it's bad because now we are only peaceful, more rational, not about civil election. And then they tell you, so this is so bad, they just extend it to families and having children as well, right? That just doesn't make sense. This balance of power is something that's not on people. I think so it hasn't been told. What would you want to extend it? Right? What's more important? What practical is that? See, let's remove people from society. So we have more money to spend on two people, right? That just doesn't make sense. If you want to deal with two people, you have to deal with the root of poverty, not by having more people and not when having people is going to be there. But then he comes here and draws this pathetic image of a hungry child, and they ask me to come here and defend that children should be hungry, and if your family does not have money to feed you, you should do it. See, it doesn't work that way, right? The people who are that poor, who can't have money to buy nasi lemak and go to Chinese are like 1% of the population. And yet, as a government, if you don't have money to provide welfare for that 1% of the government, then you give the tax transition and kill the 1% of the population. Sure, you think if you are that insignificant, you are that poor, you are insignificant to the economy, and you are not that much of a burden to be removed to society, looking at the third tax transition. What is to get the ideas and the problems that they have? Poor people, we have child labor, we have criminals, and that's why you should not let poor people have children, right? See, it doesn't make sense. Even rich families can be bad families. Even rich even like they have access to more resources and more money and more networks, they can become powerful politicians. Right? But let's see. I'm not quite up with that.
Yeah.
Even if the families are bad,
So
right?
yeah,
And you're a good kid in a bad family over there. Have we got anything at the state to take that on? Yes, we have. We have provided targeted welfare for those particular children. We have provided an access to free education, meaning that the possibility and opportunity for you to have a chance to go is there, and we are not depriving you for that. Well, let's get the first argument. What is poverty and what is desperation? In order for us to understand poverty, we should explain how specific concept poverty is. We can understand this
But opening up the current
these people are civil servants, people are holding construction, who are that they are also involved. These people, like I don't think the incentive for them is not a job, because as we all agree, we need to the toilet, it can be a good reason to wake up in the morning. What's a good reason for you to wake up in the morning? The food that you bring back at home for the child. Now, you're removing the only reason for these people. Now you're removing the only incentive for these people to be productive, to clean the toilet that you're supposed to do. To do the menial job that we need to be done at the end of the day. The thing is, unfair plays a significant part for those people, ladies and gentlemen. So let's see how it would happen on the other side. But because it's very important. Having a family is a traditional value, right? We are all being taught in Islam by Prophet Muhammad and Prophet Jesus and any other prophet to have families and to do that. That's a way for us to self-actualize. And that's a reason for us to live today's actual. We think it's not fair for the government to remove the reason of life of this thing to be abide with the social culture and social value. And just forget the idea that what is going to be charged is the amount of significant benefit that's going to happen. If we allow this child to fight for a scholarship to our program, if we allow them to grow the capacity to be productive member to the society, even when they are coming from the poor family, that's the only time we let them change the perception of the poor family, ladies and children. Not just by removing and not letting anyone coming from the poor family. You have to give the poor people the equal chance that you are giving. That's why you provide government tax to classification. And it's very crucial for the society to have a participation of these people. Why? Because that's the only time they can see what's the root cause of the society, root cause of the poverty, because these people have experienced that and have lived that for all their life. And when they grow up, it's possible for them to address those problems, to address the root cause of poverty, which they have a struggle, because they have the experience and they know what they have dealt with. That's the only time you have access to this information. That's why it's important. They don't have a child to be a burden, so there is no reason for the woman to put child have this exam. This is very important. Whether you're first is something that I stand here to say. It's random. And that's why it's fair. Because it's equally random to every single individual inside the society. That's what makes it unique, and that's what makes us to deal with it at the end of the day. Why? Because we don't know what's the best choice for people to make, and we cannot make that choice for them. That's why we genetically do not modify any single individual inside the society, because we don't know what they want to become, right? You cannot ensure that every child wants to be in a family, right? You cannot ensure that. Like maybe somebody didn't want to be in a middle-class family. You cannot make that choice on their behalf. It's an unfair thing. The best fair thing that this can exist is to remain to be random for every single individual. What have we done for this? We have proven through that there is significant part for the society and engineering they are told that we cannot make choices on behalf of our population. We cannot define a limit amount of side. That's very hard. They are that we deal with poverty, we deal with the root cause of poverty. We just dismiss it, ladies and gentlemen. We are very broad.
We thank the member of opposition for his speech to wrap up the case for the government bench.
It's true that some children might enjoy living in whatever household that you provide, but parents love that. A loving parent might be able to provide a loving household, and that might be just fine. But ladies and gentlemen, the fundamental thing that you have to understand is that if these children don't like where they live,
don't get to opt out, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we need to post this. Because in some circumstances where parents are unable to provide for their children, when parents are unable to provide a basic standard of living, sure, not destitute to the point where they aren't able to put food on the table, but definitely destitute enough to not be able to get a proper education, to be able to go to school just like any other kid, to not be able to get education enough to be competitive in a society that's growing more growingly competitive, ladies and gentlemen. That child does not get to opt out of that system. So fundamentally, if we're really talking about choices, if we're really talking about government stepping into the boundaries of the world and restricting private family choices, ladies and gentlemen, then we have to talk about how you're forcing a child into a life that he may never want, ladies and gentlemen, may never be able to opt out of. Your benefit of perhaps someone liking this life is an abstract benefit, but the harm that these children will face is a definite harm on this side of the house. We think that coming from closing government, we can give you many levels of contribution to this debate. But fundamentally, I think it's worth noting that the closing opposition only chose to respond to the extension of closing government when asked in a POI as an afterthought. And we think that was abhorrent on that side of the house. Because why do we think that women was an exceptionally important aspect of this debate? Because right now, as Vera rightly pointed out, we have a cultural obsession with having children. And that's why we see that reproductive awareness, and when it comes to impoverished communities, is an exceptionally low. That's why we see poor families having 8 children, 6 children, driving them deeper into poverty in this instance, ladies and gentlemen. And they find meaning in having children. That's why they have more. But under this side of the house, women don't get to choose whether or not they go to work or not. And like Bernard said, yeah, they don't have a reason to go to work because they don't have children. But even if they have children, ladies and gentlemen, they don't get to go to work because they are forced by cultural norms to stay at home and take care of their child, because that's your role as a woman, as a caretaker, as a mother, lady. And under closing government, you give plausible deniability to women to at least tell the husband with government regulation. Government says no to us having children, ladies and gentlemen, and it empowers their choice to be able to say, maybe I want to have a life of my own first and have financial stability before I plunge myself into motherhood, before I plunge myself into commitments and the cultural norms you're trying to entrench on that side of the house. That's how we thought that we needed a response from closing opposition in regards to that extension, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, why do we also think that stigma was a very important thing in this debate, ladies and gentlemen? Because it's not just as easy as rich kids playing with poor kids, because that attitude, as rightly pointed out by Dara as well, entrenches itself in how we treat each other in society later on. The rich communities and middle income communities have very little concern when it comes to times of elections, the times of threatening politicians in terms of manifestos, in terms of what concerns the poor. Oftentimes, they have very vindictive attitudes when it comes to the poor. They are lazy, that's why they are poor. They chose to be there, that's why they are poor. That's the kind of attitudes that we entrench when we tell people that you chose to be poor because you had 8 kids and you didn't have a job, ladies and gentlemen. That's the kind of attitude you entrench when you tell people you're a bad parent. You chose to be in those situations. We needed a response to that as well. There were exceptional contributions that closing government brought to you. No response there. We think it's a little bit too late in width. Before I go any further, I'll just open the chance.
You will never remove the stigma on poor people's parenting skills because you don't allow them to be parents anyway, sir.
Yes, and that's good because the stigma never occurs to begin with. So, ladies and gentlemen, what else did we bring you in response? We told you also that there was a duty that was created in relation to the relationship between individuals and the state. Why so? Because when individuals create other individuals in society, the culmination of those experiences when the individual becomes an actual, functioning, mature adult that can enter into contracts, that can affect policy as we know it, ladies and gentlemen, is an individual that the state has to be responsible for and society has to bear the cost of that individual. Not to mention that the welfare that the individual will take up if he becomes unemployed, if he is not educated enough, if he becomes a drug abuser. Because let's face it, poor communities statistically are more likely to fall into vices like falling into gangs, alcoholism, and things like that. Those things have to be borne by society. Does that not mean that society and government have at least some degree of right to intervene into the private sphere to stop that harm from ever occurring to begin with? And I think that's exceptionally important for them to respond to. What did they tell us when we told you there was a greater probability of harm on this house? First is that they told us we have welfare. We already took that down when we had the POI opening. But pushing that analysis further, ladies and gentlemen, if we're really talking about these individuals, we're not really talking about the bottom rung of society that Vera was talking about. But we're talking about the lower middle income families and perhaps lower income families. But these individuals may be able to afford a child today. But these are the individuals that don't foresee that children are an exponentially multiplying cost as they grow up, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that schools become more expensive as you grow up, cost of living becomes more expensive as children grow up. Fundamentally, these individuals cannot foresee that. And on a balance of probabilities, are we willing to gamble that some people might be aware of these things or acknowledge that most people aren't aware of these things, ladies and gentlemen? We think we need to legislate on a balance of probabilities and protect children, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, they told us, all right, people didn't choose to be born into this life. We sympathize with that. We agree that individuals didn't choose to be in life of poverty. But however, what are choices? Choices are, for example, knowing that you need a certain 3,000 or 4,000 ringgit to live in KL, or for example, you need to take on the kind of government investments or the kind of government policies that provide you opportunities, but you don't need to. Having 8 children is also a choice. These things limit your social mobility and fundamentally entrench you in the kind of poverty that you're trying to get out of. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's just about a balance of probabilities, because we always balance out probabilities when it comes to children. Are children more likely than not to get harmed under opposition than not? We beg to oppose. Thank you.
We thank the government whip to invite the final speaker of the day today.
Aside to proposition, we admire the fact that Associate Government and the whole government bench wants to determine how our future would look like. The biggest problem they've got is how it would impact the present. Ladies and gentlemen, inside government has been extensively argued in the vacuum of the absence of poor people today. And that's where the grants extension came in very relevant. We talk to you about the extensive stigmatization of the presence of the poor in the country, and how then the sort of policy making that they want to initiate towards alleviating the state of the poor would never ever materialize. Why? In most speeches, they told you how rich people or generally people in society have this sense of hatred towards the poor people. What message is the government then sending when they say, well, it's always been the fault of the poor people, and we don't think that we should at all try to do anything about it in terms of alleviating that problem? Highly problematic. Why? Because when you have a significant lack of any sort of initiative on the ground to create any sort of policies that support people, you get opposition to policies like BR1M, you get opposition to policies like introducing the GST. Why? Because now the rich would then say the government has conceded and agreed to the fact that the poor are not our responsibility, and any problem that could arise out of it, their poverty, is something that we should never ever deal with. The little bit of welfare that we have existing today, as far as education is concerned, that allows these individuals to access society at its highest levels, is the sort of welfare that we will lose, in other words, reverse, when we tell people that it is the fault of the poor for being poor. Sit down. Let's look at a couple of things that Nick talked about, then overall government, and I'll move on talking about why we, imposing opposition, were the most relevant in this debate, because we were the most comprehensive. First, he told you that the children can't opt out. That's exactly the problem, the fact that the poor can't opt out either. Why? Because the state policies are the exact very reason why these individuals are in the circumstance they're in. Why is it that a parent can't alleviate themselves in terms of social mobility? Is it because they don't want to get richer? Not true. Sit down. It is because they're at a stage of their lives where they can't do much about their lives. And that's where the right extension comes in as well. When it comes to the incentive for these individuals, the parents to participate in society and work harder is for the child to grow up and create a sort of social change in terms of addressing the root cause of poverty, because they know how poverty looks like and they know how to change it. We always assume that a poor child will always come out ignorant and a poor child would never ever enter Harvard. And scholarships would probably say, if you're poor, I'm sorry, I will never ever consider you. What then is the incentive of anybody to participate in the sort of policies that exist in society to rectify the root cause of poverty? The biggest question inside government is how their policy in any way addresses the existence of the poor, except for eradicating their existence, which we don't think is a good way. Let's be honest for a moment. The inception of the affirmative action for public affairs in Malaysia on independence and a lot of other affirmative action policies that we have in the country is because the government recognizes social injustices that need to be rectified. It recognizes the root causes of these problems. In the case of the Boybucha, we recognize there was a significant lack of education, that's why we formed UTMAR, or a significant lack of access to financial institutions, and hence we provide them loan free. I am being serious here. That is why these institutions exist, to rectify errors. What is that point you need to? What Behra talked to you about? The root cause of the problem is what we need to address, not a symptom of the problem, which is the existence of a child. As much as it is something that is cultural, that I want to have 6 to 8 kids, we don't think it's a choice. But now, on the myth saying that Behra never really addressed Rafiq's extension. He did, and what he said in response to the POI was extensively sufficient. You know why? Because when you tell people the poor shouldn't have children, the father isn't going to let the wife work, because if they're as patriarchal as you say they are, they will never ever react to this. But what's the bigger problem? If you're really trying to empower women in a society that you say is extensively patriarchal, like Malaysia, what about in the higher echelons of society where the rich exist or the higher middle class exists? Will that ever change anything in terms of the empowerment of women, when your condition for a woman working is the inability of the man to actually have money? Very bad idea to propagate in society. I'll take close on. And why is that problematic? How then are they supposed to achieve social mobility? When nobody in government or when nobody in society, because they actually can't feel what I'm feeling, cares about what happens to me, the best individual to do so is me and not anybody else. I think we can all agree to that. Moving on to other things he talked about. The plausible deniability of women. Behra told you that will never happen, because if they are patriarchal, they keep her at home. Plus, they won't have a reason to want more money, because you told them they can't have children. It's a lot easier not to have children than in that case. They need to tell us, or rather they can't, because they didn't. Tell us what the sort of impact on policy making becomes. A couple of things I'll be addressing, because I feel I've addressed everything that Thai government wanted to bring to us today. First, they told us that we need to be able to access children and therefore provide them the sort of welfare, sit down, and their failure then means we can't access these children. In China, the reason why we have a problem with children is because the one-child policy pushes children underground, something the Prime Minister talked about, taking these children away. We won't be able to access them anymore. So whatever semblance of hope you had for these children, because of any sort of welfare, is gone, because it's illegal for me to have a child. But you've conceded that people have a natural incentive to have a child and always want to have a child. How then do you deal with that problem? You will never ever be able to access these children. The biggest problem with Thai government is they assume malicious intent of these parents. And that's why all of our POIs were very, very relevant and real. Something Behra talked to you about as well in his POI and in his speech. Would we then design babies simply to ensure that they are successful? There is no objective yardstick for what leads to success. People from rich families end up being stupid and end up not going anywhere. What causes crime isn't poverty. What causes crime is an absence of education, an absence of a willing government to address the root cause of the problem, and discrimination from society that entrenches the ideology towards these people, that ensures that they never ever get out of the hellhole that they call slums. The biggest issue in this debate is considering the lottery of birth is random and unfair. Should the state attempt to meddle with it? in a manner that does not reduce the randomness, but stigmatizes a certain group of individuals and entrenches the existing population. Your policy might eradicate poverty in the long term, but we don't think that's helpful. Because as a government, we should be targeting, dealing with the root cause of the problem. And the root cause of the problem is stigma that re-entrenches these individuals. Affirmative action is a policy that the government has always championed. We don't think discrimination is the way to go.
We can individually for this speech. I think another round of applause for those 8 great speeches. I'd like to kindly ask the debate